I've been experimenting with something called silk ribbon embroidery. The only trouble is I don't actually have any silk ribbons at home, so I had to find some alternatives. I've had these hand painted ribbons for a while, and in my head, I thought they were silk. But as soon as I picked them up, I could tell that they were not. And I also have this lovely pink chiffon type fabric, which I also thought was silk. Turns out it's also not silk. But today I'd like to show you how I worked with this piece here, which I believe to be silk. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut myself a narrow strip. Now, how narrow, how wide? Well, it has to be fairly narrow, and I'm going to say 3 to 5 millimeters. Is that a quarter of an inch? More than an eighth of an inch? Less than a quarter of an inch? Now you want it to be wide enough so that your ribbon doesn't fall apart, and that width will vary depending on your piece of fabric. So the only way to really know is to cut out a piece and see if you can give it a tug without it starting to fall apart. Now the other thing that you need is a sewing needle that has a large eye, a long, narrow eye. You don't really want a really thick needle because it will just poke big holes in your cloth, but you want something with a big eye. And we're going to do something called straight stitch, which is essentially a longer version of the seed stitch, which is the family of stitches that I'm working on in my weekly stitching project for this month. And it's that simple. You just put your needle into the cloth and then pull it down somewhere else. And yes, this is a little bit more difficult than sewing with regular ribbon, and the thicker or bulkier your thread is, the more difficult it is to pull through. And that's why silk is a good choice, because it compacts down into really small spaces and then puffs right up again. So I'm going to make my stitches into a flower because silk ribbon embroidery is beautiful for flowers. And the way that I'm creating my petals of a flower is I'm going to stitch in the shape of a Y and then add 2 extra spokes to fill in the flower shape. And I say this every time I make a video. I'm not worried about this being precise and exact. I can add things to it later on. I'm just laying down the first layer here. And as we go, I'll decorate these flowers more. They'll become more detailed. You can do all kinds of stitches with silk ribbon, but there are particular stitches like this one, the straight stitch, French knots, and chain stitch that are particularly good with ribbon. And there is one stitch that you really can only do with silk ribbon, and that is called ribbon stitch. And that's what I'm going to share with my Ko-fi supporters this month. And my Ko-fi subscribers will get early access to the videos as well as a few bonuses each month. And I'd love to have you join us over there. But before I do that, I would like to share a little trick for threading your needle because, as I mentioned, you need to have a needle with a large eye. But even so, I had a hard time getting the flimsy silk fabric to thread through the needle, even with a big eye. So I came up with a little hack, and I know that there are needle threaders, and some people use loops of dental floss to help them thread their needles, but I want to add as little extra bulk as I possibly can. So I picked up a single strand of embroidery floss, and probably sewing thread would be an even better idea. And I folded that over into a loop, and I'm going to thread the 2 loose ends through my needle, and then I'm going to tuck my ribbon through the loop there, and then it's a bit tough and I had to wiggle it around and move things to a thinner part of the ribbon, but you do need a fairly sturdy ribbon to be able to do all that manipulating. And I'm going to give you a little cautionary story here. When you're working with the silk ribbon, and if you're making a flower like I did, as you're stitching into the middle of your flower, you want to be very careful to not overlap your stitches, because as you can see here, I've stitched into the ribbon, and I'm having a really difficult time pulling the thread through those many layers of fabric and ribbon on the back. So I would recommend that you place your stitches near each other but not over top of each other. And as usual, thanks for watching, and I hope you feel inspired to make something interesting. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.